There exists within the realm of human psychology a tragic irony that Jung identified with both fascination and horror. Those who possess the most beautiful qualities of soul, genuine kindness, authentic compassion, natural generosity, often become the preferred hunting grounds for psychological predators who have learned to exploit these very virtues as pathways to destruction. Your kindness, which should be your greatest strength, has become your most dangerous vulnerability. Your compassion, which should connect you to the best in humanity, has become a beacon that draws the worst of human nature directly to your door. This is not an accident, not bad luck, not a series of unfortunate coincidences, but a precise psychological phenomenon that operates with the predictability of natural law. Jung understood what kind people refuse to acknowledge, that predators are not random in their selection of victims, but sophisticated in their targeting, drawn to specific psychological signatures that kind people unconsciously broadcast into the world. These predators possess what amounts to a sixth sense for identifying individuals whose boundaries are porous, whose self-worth is negotiable, whose desire to help others overrides their instinct for self-protection. They can sense kindness the way sharks sense blood in the water, not as something to admire, but as something to consume. The kind person operates from what I call benevolent naivety, the unconscious assumption that others share their values, motivations, and basic humanity. They project their own goodness onto others and cannot conceive that someone might approach them with purely exploitative intentions. This psychological blindness creates what amounts to a predator detection disability. They miss the subtle signs of manipulation, dismiss red flags as misunderstandings, and excuse exploitative behavior as the result of pain, trauma, or temporary circumstances, rather than recognizing it as the calculated strategy of someone who has learned to weaponize others' compassion. This innocence manifests as what Jung would recognize as projection of the positive shadow. The kind person cannot acknowledge the existence of genuine evil, pure selfishness, or calculated cruelty, because these qualities are so foreign to their own nature that they literally cannot perceive them accurately. They see manipulation and assume miscommunication. They encounter exploitation and diagnose misunderstanding. They experience abuse and blame themselves for not being patient enough, understanding enough, or helpful enough to prevent it. The predator recognizes this innocence immediately and approaches not with obvious aggression, but with carefully crafted vulnerability. They present themselves as wounded souls in need of the very kindness they intend to exploit. They share tragic backstories designed to trigger the kind person's rescue instincts. They reveal just enough pain to activate compassion while hiding the calculating intelligence that orchestrates every revelation for maximum emotional impact. The kind person, unable to conceive of such sophisticated deception, opens their heart to what they believe is authentic suffering while unknowingly inviting a parasite into their psychological ecosystem. The truly dangerous predators are those who have learned to mimic kindness itself, presenting themselves as fellow helpers, fellow givers, fellow souls committed to making the world a better place. They speak the language of compassion fluently, while possessing none of its substance. They understand the psychology of kind people so thoroughly that they can play the role of wounded helper, struggling giver, or overwhelmed caregiver in ways that bypass every conscious defense while triggering every unconscious rescue impulse. Perhaps most tragically, the kind person's very attempts to protect themselves often make them more vulnerable rather than less. They try to be understanding when they should be suspicious, patient when they should be firm, forgiving when they should be final. They interpret their own discomfort as evidence of their lack of compassion rather than as their psyche's attempt to warn them of danger. They override their intuitive alarm system in service of their conscious values, creating a perfect storm of vulnerability that sophisticated predators know how to exploit with devastating efficiency. The predator's approach is often so gradual, so subtle, so carefully calibrated to the specific psychology of their kind target, that the exploitation feels like friendship, the manipulation feels like mutual care, the parasitism feels like partnership. By the time the kind person recognizes what has happened, they have often been so depleted, so confused, so gaslit about their own perceptions, that they question whether they have any right to complain about treatment they unconsciously collaborated in creating. What makes psychological predators so devastatingly effective against kind people is not their obvious aggression or transparent manipulation, but their sophisticated understanding of how compassionate minds work, how generous hearts operate, how empathic souls process information about others' pain and need. These predators have essentially written an unconscious manual for exploiting kindness, developing techniques so refined and approaches so psychologically precise that they can turn a person's greatest virtues into their most dangerous liabilities with surgical accuracy. The predator's first technique is what I call vulnerability presentation. They approach kind people not as predators, but as wounded prey. Not as threats, but as victims themselves in need of exactly the type of care that kind people are compelled to provide. They have learned that kind people cannot resist authentic suffering and have become masterful at manufacturing the appearance of pain, trauma, and desperate need. They share stories of abuse, abandonment, betrayal, and loss that are calibrated to trigger maximum empathy while revealing just enough detail to seem authentic without providing enough specificity to be verified. Perhaps their most insidious technique is graduated exploitation. They begin with small requests, minor boundary violations, and seemingly innocent needs that establish the pattern of the kind person saying yes to their demands. The initial requests are so reasonable, so understandable, so modest that refusing them would seem cruel. But each compliance creates precedent for the next, slightly larger request. The predator gradually escalates their demands, always staying just within the range of what the kind person can rationalize as reasonable help for someone in genuine need. The sophisticated predator also employs empathy hijacking. They learn to read the kind person's emotional state with predatory accuracy and mirror back exactly the energy that will create maximum connection and minimum suspicion. If the kind person is feeling lonely, the predator becomes the perfect companion. If they are feeling misunderstood, the predator becomes the one who truly sees them. If they are feeling unappreciated, the predator becomes their greatest admirer. This mirroring creates an artificial intimacy that feels more real than authentic connection because it is precisely tailored to fill the kind person's exact emotional needs. One of the most devastating techniques is what Jung would recognize as rescue fantasy activation. The predator presents themselves as someone who could be saved if only they received the right kind of help, the proper amount of care, the perfect dose of understanding. They position their relationship with the kind person as potentially transformative, suggesting that this connection could be the thing that finally heals their wounds, changes their life, or helps them become the person they were meant to be. The kind person becomes invested not just in helping, but in being the one whose love finally makes the difference. The predator also masters crisis cycling. They alternate periods of apparent improvement with dramatic setbacks, moments of gratitude with episodes of desperate need, times of stability with emergencies that require immediate intervention. This cycle keeps the kind person emotionally engaged and prevents them from developing the psychological distance necessary to evaluate the relationship objectively. Just when the kind person begins to feel drained or doubtful, the predator shows enough improvement to renew hope or creates enough crisis to trigger renewed rescue efforts. Perhaps most chillingly, the sophisticated predator employs virtue manipulation. They use the kind person's own values against them, framing their requests for help in terms of the very principles the kind person holds most dear. They appeal to their target's sense of justice, compassion, loyalty, or spiritual growth. They make saying no seem like a betrayal of the kind person's own moral code, transforming reasonable boundary setting into apparent cruelty, healthy self-protection into seeming selfishness. The predator also utilizes guilt amplification. They become experts at triggering shame in their targets for normal human limitations, reasonable boundaries, or healthy self-care. They make the kind person feel guilty for being tired, selfish for having needs, cruel for setting limits, inadequate for not being able to solve problems that may be unsolvable. This guilt manipulation ensures continued compliance even when the kind person's own well-being is clearly suffering. Most insidiously, they practice reality distortion, gradually altering the kind person's perception of normal relationship dynamics, reasonable expectations, and healthy boundaries. They normalize their own dysfunctional behavior while pathologizing their target's attempts at self-protection, creating a psychological environment where exploitation feels normal and resistance feels wrong. There exists within the spectrum of kind people a particular type that Jung would have recognized as the most vulnerable to predatory exploitation: the wounded healer, the person whose own unresolved trauma has created an unconscious compulsion to save others from similar pain. These individuals, driven by their own unhealed wounds to help those who suffer, become perfect prey for sophisticated predators who have learned to weaponize the helper's own trauma as the pathway to their destruction. The wounded healer's kindness is not pure generosity, but compensatory behavior, not simple compassion, but complex psychology, making them exquisitely vulnerable to those who understand how to exploit their specific psychological architecture. The wounded healer operates from what I call trauma bonding, disguised as empathy. They are unconsciously drawn to people whose pain mirrors their own, whose dysfunction resonates with their own unresolved issues, whose brokenness activates their own need to prove that healing is possible. They see in troubled others the possibility of healing their own wounded child, of fixing retroactively what was broken in themselves, of demonstrating that love can indeed conquer the very traumas that shape their own psychology. This makes them extraordinarily susceptible to predators who present with stories and symptoms that precisely match the wounded healer's own areas of unresolved pain. The predator targeting a wounded healer employs what I call trauma mirroring. They present their own supposed wounds in ways that eerily echo the helper's own unhealed experiences. If the wounded healer survived abandonment, the predator shares stories of being left behind. If the helper endured emotional abuse, the predator describes similar maltreatment. If the wounded healer grew up with addiction in the family, the predator struggles with substance abuse. This mirroring creates an instant sense of connection and understanding that bypasses rational evaluation and triggers the wounded healer's deepest rescue impulses. The wounded healer is particularly vulnerable because their helping is motivated not by strength, but by unresolved weakness, not by wholeness, but by their own brokenness seeking completion through others' healing. They cannot distinguish between genuine empathy and trauma reenactment, between healthy helping and compulsive rescuing, between being drawn to someone because they can genuinely help and being drawn to someone because their own wounds demand attention through proxy healing. This creates what Jung would recognize as unconscious collusion. The wounded healer and the predator engage in a dance where both parties are getting something they desperately need, while neither acknowledges the true nature of the exchange. The wounded healer gets to feel powerful through helping someone even more damaged than themselves, while the predator gets unlimited access to care, attention, and resources from someone whose own trauma makes them incapable of maintaining healthy boundaries around their giving. The predator exploiting a wounded healer also uses healing fantasy manipulation. They position the relationship as mutually healing, suggesting that the wounded healer's care is not just helping them, but somehow completing the helper's own healing journey. They make statements like, "You understand me in a way no one else has," or being with you is healing my faith in humanity, or I think we were meant to help each other. This creates the illusion of reciprocal healing, while the flow of care and resources moves primarily in one direction. Perhaps most insidiously, the predator uses re-traumatization cycles. They unconsciously recreate scenarios that trigger the wounded healer's original trauma, putting them back into familiar dynamics of trying to save someone who cannot or will not be saved. The wounded healer, driven by their own unresolved pain, cannot recognize that they are being deliberately placed into situations designed to activate their trauma responses and override their rational judgment. The wounded healer also falls victim to what I call specialness projection. The predator makes them feel uniquely qualified to provide help, specially chosen to offer healing, exclusively capable of understanding their particular brand of suffering. This feeds the wounded healer's need to feel important and valuable, while binding them to a relationship that systematically exploits their trauma-driven compulsion to rescue others. The most tragic aspect of this dynamic is that the wounded healer's genuine desire to heal and be healed becomes the very mechanism of their exploitation. Their own unresolved trauma creates blind spots that predators navigate with predatory precision, turning the helper's greatest vulnerability, their own unhealed wounds, into the pathway for systematic psychological and emotional extraction. The wounded healer gives not from abundance, but from deficit, not from strength, but from their own desperate need to prove that healing is possible, making them perfect hosts for those who have learned to feed off others' hope, care, and unresolved pain. What Jung understood about psychological predation that makes it truly terrifying is not just its individual manifestations, but its collective nature. The way predatory behavior becomes institutionalized, normalized, and even celebrated in systems that have learned to exploit kindness on a massive scale. The kind person does not just face individual predators, but entire predatory ecosystems, families that systematically exploit the generous member, workplaces that drain empathetic employees, religious communities that consume the faithful, social movements that devour their most dedicated supporters. These collective predators operate with the same sophistication as individual ones, but with exponentially greater power and social protection. The family system, infected by collective predation, creates what I call designated kindness roles. Certain family members are unconsciously assigned the function of being endlessly available, perpetually understanding, chronically self-sacrificing for the benefit of other family members who are permitted to be selfish, demanding, and exploitative. The kind family member becomes the emotional regulation system for everyone else. The unpaid therapist, the family bank, the crisis manager who absorbs all dysfunction while maintaining the illusion of family harmony. In workplace environments, collective predation manifests as what Jung would recognize as institutional vampirism, organizations that systematically identify and exploit employees with strong work ethics, genuine care for others, and natural helping instincts. These employees are loaded with additional responsibilities without additional compensation, expected to work longer hours because of their dedication, asked to take on emotional labor that is not part of their job description, and gradually consumed by systems that reward their kindness with increased exploitation, while protecting those who contribute less but demand more. Religious and spiritual communities often become the most sophisticated predatory systems because they weaponize the very values that kind people hold most sacred. They create what I call spiritual manipulation, using concepts like forgiveness, service, sacrifice, and unconditional love as tools to extract labor, money, time, and emotional energy from those whose spiritual beliefs make them vulnerable to exploitation disguised as divine calling. The kind person's desire to serve God, help humanity, or grow spiritually becomes the pathway through which they are systematically drained by systems that profit from their devotion. Social and political movements can also become predatory systems that consume their most passionate supporters. They employ what I call cause manipulation, using the kind person's genuine concern for justice, equality, or social change as leverage to extract unlimited labor, resources, and emotional investment. The kind person's dedication to making the world better becomes the justification for accepting treatment that makes their own world worse, for sacrificing their well-being in service of causes that often benefit those who contribute less but demand more. These collective predatory systems are protected by what Jung called social shadow projection, the cultural tendency to idealize selflessness while demonizing healthy self-interest, to celebrate endless giving while pathologizing reasonable boundaries, to praise those who sacrifice themselves for others while criticizing those who maintain their own well-being. This creates a social environment where predatory behavior is disguised as virtue and self-protection is reframed as selfishness. The collective predator also employs virtue signaling as camouflage. Predatory systems often present themselves as the most caring, moral, family-oriented, or socially conscious organizations. They use the language of love while practicing exploitation, speak of unity while creating hierarchy, claim to build up while systematically tearing down their most generous members. The most dangerous predatory systems are those that have learned to disguise their consumption as their greatest virtue. Perhaps most insidiously, these systems create what I call kindness competition. They pit kind people against each other in contests of who can give more, sacrifice more, serve more faithfully, love more unconditionally. This competition ensures a steady supply of people willing to be exploited, while creating shame in those who attempt to set boundaries or prioritize their own well-being. The collective shadow of predatory systems is maintained through enabler networks, people who benefit from the exploitation of kind individuals and therefore have vested interests in maintaining systems that allow such exploitation to continue. These enablers may not be predators themselves, but become complicit in predatory systems because they receive advantages from the overgiving of others that they are unwilling to surrender. The most chilling aspect of collective predation is how it makes individual predatory behavior seem normal, even virtuous. When entire systems operate by exploiting kindness, the kind person loses the ability to recognize exploitation as abnormal and begins to see their own resistance to being consumed as evidence of their moral failure rather than their psychological health. We arrive now at the most crucial transformation in the journey of the kind soul, the development of what Jung would call protected kindness, compassion that maintains its generosity while developing the wisdom to distinguish between genuine need and manipulative exploitation, love that gives freely while refusing to be consumed, service that uplifts others without destroying the self. This is not the hardening of the heart, but its maturation, not the abandonment of kindness, but its evolution into a form so refined, so conscious, so skillfully wielded that it becomes immune to predatory exploitation while remaining infinitely generous to authentic need. The development of protected kindness begins with what I call predator literacy, learning to read the subtle signs of exploitative intention before the damage is done, developing the psychological equivalent of an immune system that can identify and neutralize threats to your well-being without becoming paranoid or closed-hearted. This literacy includes recognizing the difference between someone asking for help and someone demanding servitude, between someone sharing vulnerability and someone weaponizing it, between someone expressing gratitude and someone manufacturing obligation. Protected kindness requires what Jung called conscious discrimination, the development of internal criteria for when to give and when to withhold, when to help and when to refuse, when to be available and when to be absent. This discrimination is not cruel but wise, not selfish, but sustainable, not cold, but conscious. The person with protected kindness learns that saying no to exploitation is saying yes to authentic service, that refusing to be consumed allows for genuine contribution, that maintaining boundaries creates space for real intimacy. Perhaps most importantly, protected kindness develops through what I call abundance-based giving, offering help from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than weakness. When kindness flows from personal wholeness rather than personal deficit, it becomes naturally resistant to exploitation because it does not seek validation, approval, or meaning through the act of giving. The giver can afford to be selective because their worth is not dependent on their usefulness. The person with protected kindness also develops reciprocity consciousness, the ability to assess whether relationships involve mutual exchange or one-way extraction, whether care flows both directions or pools entirely in service of one party, whether giving is appreciated or merely expected. They become willing to end relationships that consistently drain them, regardless of how those relationships present themselves or how guilty ending them might make them feel. Protected kindness also requires what Jung understood as shadow integration, acknowledging and accepting their own capacity for selfishness, anger, judgment, and cruelty. When kind people accept their own shadow, they become less susceptible to manipulation by others who exploit their fear of being seen as bad, mean, or selfish. They develop the capacity to be temporarily unkind in service of long-term kindness, to disappoint individuals in order to maintain their ability to serve the collective. This evolution creates what I call discerning compassion, the ability to feel genuine empathy for someone's pain while refusing to take responsibility for healing it, to acknowledge someone's suffering while maintaining boundaries around how much you will sacrifice to alleviate it, to care deeply while acting wisely. The person with protected kindness can sit with others' pain without being consumed by it, can witness suffering without being compelled to rescue, can love without being obligated to fix. Protected kindness also develops crisis non-reactivity, the ability to remain calm and boundaried when others create emergencies designed to trigger rescue responses. The protected kind person learns to distinguish between genuine crisis that deserves immediate attention and manufactured drama that seeks to bypass normal boundaries through artificial urgency. They develop the capacity to say, "I care about your situation, but I will not be available to help until tomorrow," without guilt or anxiety. Perhaps most beautifully, protected kindness creates what Jung would call authentic generosity. Giving that comes from genuine desire to contribute rather than compulsive need to be needed. Service that uplifts both giver and receiver, rather than depleting one to sustain the other. Love that enhances rather than diminishes those it touches. This kindness is more powerful than its unprotected predecessor because it is sustainable, more generous because it is conscious, more healing because it is wholesome. The person with protected kindness becomes what I call a fortress of love, strong enough to contain immense compassion without being overwhelmed by it, secure enough to give generously without being depleted by it, wise enough to serve others without sacrificing themselves. They discover that the highest form of kindness is not unlimited availability, but conscious presence, not endless giving, but sustainable generosity, not self-sacrifice, but self-respect that creates space for authentic service. Your kindness is not meant to be consumed, but cultivated, not exploited, but honored, not weaponized against you, but wielded by you in service of what is genuinely good, truly healing, and authentically loving in this world. If you recognize yourself as a magnet for predators, if you see your own kindness being systematically exploited in these patterns, then your protection begins with the most difficult act for a kind person: disappointing someone who has learned to depend on your inability to disappoint them, Start today, not because you want to be cruel, but because you want your kindness to serve what is truly good rather than what is merely manipulative. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to develop the psychological sophistication to distinguish between genuine need and predatory exploitation. Share this video with another kind soul who needs to understand that their compassion has become their vulnerability and that protecting their kindness is not selfishness but wisdom. And most importantly, practice this today. Identify one person or situation where your kindness is being systematically exploited. Notice how they approach you only when they need something, how they share just enough pain to trigger your rescue instincts, how they make you feel guilty for having boundaries, say no to their next request, feel their attempts to manipulate you back into compliance, and stand firm anyway. Your kindness is precious. Your compassion is sacred. Your generosity is a gift that should be treasured, not consumed. The people who truly deserve your care will respect your boundaries. Those who become angry when you protect yourself were never worthy of your kindness in the first place. Stop being a magnet for predators and become a fortress of love, strong enough to protect your compassion, wise enough to discern authentic need, generous enough to give freely without being taken advantage of. The world needs your kindness, but it needs it protected, conscious, and sustainable, not depleted, exploited, and destroyed by those who mistake your compassion for weakness. Your kindness with boundaries is more powerful than kindness without them ever could be.